Sam Bock. I am History Colorado's Director of Interpretation and Publications, which means pretty much any of the words that go through our museum come through my desk. It does not suck. It is a great job. And tonight I'm here to shamelessly plug my new book. I mean, talk to you about saloons and beer on the frontier here in Colorado. And just to get started, this is kind of the premise of my book, but also something that I'm really passionate about, because I can stand here and I can give you a long, droning talk about mining history, and that's something that some people might be interested in, or we could talk a little bit about how towns came around in Colorado. I can stand right in front of a projector, that would be great. But none of those things are particularly captivating in the way that beer and saloons are. But this is a trick, because those are the things that I'm about to talk all about. As it turns out, here in Colorado, so many of our towns, particularly our high-altitude mountain towns, our playgrounds now, started as saloons. The very first building in most of the mining towns of Colorado were saloons. And what's really interesting, I think, particularly about that here in Colorado, is that our state was founded at the outset of a beer boom, a lager beer boom, actually. This beer, it's a lighter style if you're not familiar. A lot of darker, heavier beers. Those tend to be coming from the English ale tradition. Lager beer is German, and it came to the United States with German immigrants in the 1850s, right around the time that Colorado was starting to develop towns during the gold rush. The gold rush itself was mythologized in real time. So many of the figures that we know from that time really just got built up to be these larger-than-life people, the Tabors and the mining magnates that we all know from Colorado history. And I think by coming down to the on-the-ground, everyday pedestrian things that were almost not worth documenting and were unremarkable even at the time, allows us to get a glimpse into the past that's unobscured by all the glitter of the gold rush. So, I think we're taking a look into our past through the lens of a pint glass tonight, and if you take a look at your beer, it's probably one of about 430 some odd breweries in the state right now. And for a state that doesn't grow really a lot of barley or hops and has a very acute water shortage, the question is, why such a robust brewing industry here in Colorado? And I think, if we were to go back to 1859, to the earliest days of the gold rush, we would want to have the founding figure of our Colorado brewing industry be something like, an illustrious German brewmaster who rides into town on a cart pulled by Clydesdales and says something like, I doff my cap at the best place in the country with the clearest water and the best access to barley, and, I'm going to brew beer that will be worthy of this, wonderful, huge industry that we're going to bring forth here in this mountain state. That didn't happen at all, even close. It turns out the first person to even have any knowledge of brewing beer on an industrial scale to come to Colorado was Saran St. Vrain, a partner in the Bent's Fort enterprise, the trading fort that the Bent brothers and Saran St. Vrain established along the Arkansas River in the 1830s. His family were longtime brewmasters. In fact, his father ran a brewery in St. Louis that burned down. But there's no archaeological or historical evidence that Saran St. Vrain had anything stronger than lemonade at Bent's Fort. Whiskey, certainly, but definitely not beer. And Saran St. Vrain might have been a teetotaler, actually. So the actual founding figures, the ones who really are not household names in any way, shape, or form, are these guys, John Good and Fred Solomon, two Eastern European immigrants with general knowledge of brewing who came to Denver in 1859 upon hearing of the gold strikes. And they were really just coming to make a living among, brewing beer as one enterprise among many, many others. They were merchants, essentially. They were importing the goods that the miners need. So, mining equipment, but also clothing and shoes and horseshoes and bit and tackle and all those things you need just to make a life here in 1859. And they opened Colorado's first brewery, which was the Rocky Mountain Brewery. And if any of you are familiar with Denver, it was essentially where the Auraria campus is today, right where the Tivoli Brewing Company is, right in the middle of downtown, close to downtown. And they commenced to brewing almost right away. And you can see here, I've highlighted this, they were immediately brewing lager beer. So the lager craze that swept through the United States in the early part, or the middle part of the 1800s, arrived in Colorado at its founding moment. So lagers, saloons, immigrants, these things are the foundational story of our beer industry and really of our state. In a little over 30 years, from about 1860 to about 1890, Colorado went from this brewing shed near Denver to dozens of factory-sized brewing companies. This is Coors in Golden. This is the second iteration. This is the massive industrial brewery, the sort of the foundation, the cornerstone for what is today the largest single-site brewery in North America. Still the Coors Brewing Company. And so the story of how we got there is really the subject of this evening. And I think, we're going to kind of weave in and out of Steamboat history. I don't like to come to places and tell you your history. I did a little looking up, a little bit of research in the Colorado Historic Newspaper Archive collection. So when the time comes, I'm going to need you to help me fill in some dots here. But I did find some really interesting stories. So the story of how towns like Steamboat, towns that today are our outdoor recreation hubs, came to be, really does start in saloons. And essentially, the foundation of these towns in Colorado isn't like anything that happened anywhere else. In fact, they skipped the more the more bucolic phases of town development by having an instant economy, by having this gold coming straight out of the ground. And in fact, in most early saloons in Colorado, you could pay for your beer with pinches of gold dust using scales that bartenders kept on the counter, which I think really just goes to show you how, having money coming out of the ground and then going instantly into people's pockets churned this economy and created these towns overnight. The saloon in these early days, like this one in Creed, to call them a building is probably generous. The idea was, there's a conglomeration of men here, they're all thirsty, there's nothing else to do, lots of mental health issues, and not only that, but they come from places that were rooted in European beer drinking traditions, which is to say, liberally lubricated. So when they arrived, and there was somebody here who was serving whiskey, most likely, in those earliest saloons, they were just happy to have any at all. And in fact, the weekly whiskey ration was something that you find in letters home from these miners all the time. And the amounts are shocking, like gallons consumed every month. It's a little outrageous. But if a town stuck around, if the mining load proved out, or if there was enough of a population base in nearby mountain valleys, saloon owners would often build a roof, unlike future airport architects. But the roof was really a marker of distinction, because there's no reason to put a roof on your saloon if you're not planning on being there over winter for a couple of seasons even. And so you can actually kind of track the progress of town development in early Colorado history by whether or not the saloon had a roof on it. And saloons, being pretty much the only buildings in town, served as way more than just a place to get a drink. And in fact, actually, they were, post office, they were your bank, they were a hotel. Plenty of immigrants to Colorado spent the first nights here sleeping on a barroom floor. Later on, you could get your, a lot of them were mercantile stores, and they provided middle-class jobs, which I think is kind of fascinating if you think about it, because most of the people coming here ended up being go-backers, right? They would come out, they would find that the rumors of gold were, vastly estimated, and they just would end up going back home. If you were going to stick around and you wanted a more stable all-season source of income, owning a saloon was actually a really, really good way to make your way into the middle class. And it ended up creating a town, a community identity around this figure of the barman. And the barman had to be your friend, he had to be your cop, he had to be your confidant. And the most successful saloons were the ones that kept people coming back for the camaraderie, for the company, for the vibes, as the kids say, right? And those were the ones that really drove town development. The outsides of saloons, we see the echoes of these facades all across town. I'm driving through Kremlin today, right? Very easy to see this style. And it has been the Western style for centuries. But it was meant to evoke an urban sophistication that you would find in towns like Boston and cities in the East. That's why a lot of historians have kind of taken the instant city idea, right? It's not just that the gold coming out of the ground provided this instant economy, which it did, but it was intended, or the saloons, the architecture, everything about it was intended to create an urban ambiance from the very outset, even in these dusty, muddy mining communities. The insides of saloons, of course, early on, might just be a couple of gambling tables and a barber's chair and maybe some muffins if you're lucky. A lot of saloons sold baked goods on the side, because again, they were some of the only buildings in town, and so if you had a baker or somebody who was trying to sell some baked goods on the side, turns out muffins were really popular. But as time went on, and as towns continued to develop throughout the state, you got a more urban, a more sophisticated interior. And it was what historian Elliot West has termed Victorian macho, right? So you get a lot of these, a lot of taxidermy deer heads. You get a lot of patriotic bunting, very common thing to see in saloon pictures from the time. The #1 most seen image in American history, save for possibly the image of George Washington on the dollar, would have been the Battle of the Greasy Grass by Cassidy Adams, or the Battle of Little Bighorn. It was Budweiser marketing, and they distributed it to saloons for decades in the late early 1900s. And so, this is really evincing American masculinism that is extending its reach across the country, and doing so really through beer, which is something that, is on the ground. It's something you can literally consume. And I think it just went hand in hand with the ethos that was being projected across the country at the time. Victorian macho, of course, extended to the patrons, or appealed to the patrons, because most saloon patrons were men. In fact, almost all saloon patrons were men. At the time, prior to Prohibition, it was unseemly for women to be drinking indoors, especially in a saloon. There's something shady about a dark, confined room with all kinds of lusty men who, God knows what they're doing after drinking. And so the decor in all these saloons tended to be very, idealized, right? It's not just the masculine projection of economic and masculine power. It's also trying to appeal to these men who a lot of the time left their entire families. In the East, they maybe haven't seen a woman in quite some time because they're in a remote mining community and they're just short supply. So, I think what I'm trying to get at here is that by looking into these saloons, by peeking into these pictures and understanding the context of the time, we really get a sense of what it was like to be here in that first generation or two or three of folks making their way into the mountainous interior of Colorado, displacing the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute peoples, calling this place their home at the time. Not every saloon or every building was quite so ornate. So you would have had a lot of buildings that had been saloons being repurposed for miners' exchanges or mercantile buildings. Saloons that were created in the sort of first flush of town development, the ones that had a roof, but maybe weren't quite so ornate, weren't quite so fancy and upscale. They would have been competing with ones that were built, purpose-built from the ground up to be multi-storied, very ornate, very fancy buildings to draw well-off clientele. And as time went on in each of these mining communities, they kind of followed the same pattern, right? If the load proved out, the town would develop, the saloons would grow more ornate to appeal to a wealthier clientele, who in turn drew more people into the town, and thus drove the development of all these places around Colorado. And you see it, it's really funny to look in these newspapers from the time, because what you can see is sort of that first seed, and then it progresses along the same route every single time, but in different decades, right? So, saloons in Denver, those are starting in 1860, even some of them in 1859, with Rich and Lacey Wooten, who opened the first saloon there. Here in the Steamboat area, I gather it was the 1880s when the town was founded, and the very first saloons were pretty much right after that. And in fact, I did some digging around in the pilot and in the Steamboat pilot for mentions of saloons. I caught a couple that I thought were pretty entertaining. It's probably really hard to see, so I'll just give you the little highlighted part here. It says, Messrs. Snow and Riggs in April 1987 will soon have their saloon running full blast, which I thought was an interesting choice of words, especially when it comes to beer. I don't want my beer to be full blast. But there was also, of course, a smoke shop, right? This is, the age of tobacco, and they said that they've already had a free smoke from Mr. Snow. He's a good man with good cigars. Good enough, I guess, for the editor of the Steamboat pilot, or the pilot at the time. And then 2 years later here, in the special correspondence from Hans Peak paragraphs, we see actually a pretty typical notice for saloon construction. Often these things were fairly unremarkable. It was kind of the gossip pages almost. It was just conversations about town. So you see little notices about, oh, so-and-so got the lumber together and they're going to start construction on their saloon. You'll probably see it under construction in the next couple of months. And if you want to come help out, maybe they'll give you a free smoke or a beer or something like that. But I think all that kind of begs the question of, who are these people, right? I mean, we know they're men, most of them. We know that almost all of them are immigrants, but, what were they doing? Who were they? Where'd they come from? I'm glad I asked. Saloons in so many places in the state, especially as the mining economy developed and time went on, ended up being ethnic enclaves, right? Places where you could go and get a taste of home. I mean, literally, oftentimes the food of your home would be served in these places. But also speak your native language and be around people who are from the old country. And I think, for immigrants, especially folks on the just ragged edge of the American empire, it's hard to overstate how valuable that kind of thing would have been. So this is a peek into a saloon in Trinidad. And I think, it's pretty obvious just if you can see from the decor, from the clothing that people are wearing, heavily influenced by Mexican Americans who at this time, this would have been in the 1890s, would have only been Americans for about 50 years. So, it's really just worth remembering that there was nothing obvious about where any of these towns were headed when they were founded in the late 1800s, early 1900s. You all get to just sit there and drink beer, so I have to take your time. I think this is a really striking fact that 2/3 of all saloon owners would have been immigrants. And this just really reinforces this is a saloon, specifically the Scandinavian house, specifically for people from Scandinavian countries, right? It's right there on the window. So many of these people were bringing their cultures with them from their home country and sort of adapting them and figuring out how they could become part of this new United States. Again, in a lot of towns across the state, saloons were the only buildings. They were the only public meeting place. And so what you see is they often became union halls. And here we're looking at the 29th of July Saloon, which is named for the date in 1901, I believe, that King Humbert of Italy was assassinated by anarchists. Fran Mazzola, the owner of this bar, was himself an anarchist. The political party, capital A anarchist. And what's really interesting, there's a backstory here. This bar was where many of the striking miners met before the Ludlow Massacre. They discussed strike plans. They made plans to fight the Colorado National Guard, who were being deployed to end the strikes in the coal fields in southern Colorado. Well, shortly after the massacre, industrialists went on a PR campaign, and they started publishing letters to the editor, essentially, which is long screeds that were written against the miners. And the editor of the Daily Camera, the Boulder newspaper, wrote one that was published in newspapers throughout the state, including the Broward County Sentinel, that was condemning the anarchists for their brazen and dastardly attack on the Colorado National Guard at the Ludlow Massacre, which, I think is debatable, but it just goes to show that saloons were really at the center of so many parts of life in Colorado in the early days of our state, because they just played such a central role in lives of so many people, particularly the underclasses, the recently arrived immigrants, those with few means, and particularly no space of their own at home. I was told I was supposed to talk about the more raucous sides of Colorado history, so here we go. Saloons are a perfect place for that. Aside from serving as union halls, which we all know can be pretty raucous themselves, they were places to gamble. They were dens of vice and prostitution and villainy, and yet I think saloons got a really bad rap, particularly as the 20th century started to unfold. And in Colorado, those associations with union halls, the associations with prostitution, and particularly just being a drinking establishment, made saloons the target of a lot of xenophobic, anti-immigrant, classist hatred, honestly. I think that's really the right word. They were fixtures of these communities. They were obvious targets for people who wanted social reforms. But particularly the fact that they were serving alcohol overrode all of those important community values, all those community functions that saloons were serving, and particularly, made barkeepers the target of a lot of demonization that probably most didn't deserve. So with a changing society comes changing drinking habits. And we're talking about a really compressed period of time here in Colorado history. We're coming up on the 150th anniversary of the founding of our state in 2026. And that's not a lot of time, actually. So the golden age of the saloon here in Colorado, the golden age of the mining town, it's really from 1860 to 1920 or so. And really, I think that 1920 date I pick because it's convenient for me as a historian of beer to start with Prohibition in 1920, but a lot changes. Towns like Denver go from being, the ramshackle, roofless saloon on the corner to being massive towns. I mean, Denver by 1870 was the third biggest town, by 1890 was the third biggest city in the West after San Francisco and Omaha, believe it or not. Cow towns. So, we can see society changing through its sort of opinions on and approach to serving alcohol. And I thought this was really captivating, and I'm sorry again, it's far away, but I had to excerpt it from my book. I actually stole this from historian Daniel Rockran, who wrote the book on Prohibition. Last call, highly recommended if you're in the market for any book. So essentially, Americans were drinking 36 million gallons of beer in 1850. By 1890, that figure increased to 855 million gallons. So to put that another way, in just 40 years, America's population almost tripled, while our beer consumption rate grew more than 24-fold. That's a lot of beer. And there's two important things to think about with that figure. The first is this is because of immigration. This is German immigrants, Central European immigrants bringing their beer, their brewing industry, and their traditions to Colorado and to the United States more broadly. The second thing to think about there is that the drinking rate was really becoming an outstanding problem in early 20th century America. And I think for a lot of us, we get the sense of, Prohibition as being a time of speakeasies and flappers and, ragtime and jazz, and this is this glitzy, flashing lights of the 1920s. And that's really not the whole story. It was a time when America was awash in beer, and particularly in beer. And it led to a very impressive local option campaign across the country. So here in Routt County, the local optionists are at work, according to the Sentinel in 1808, which I'm reasonably sure was the first time Prohibition was on the ballot for Routt County. I don't think it passed. So if there's someone in the audience who can enlighten me a little bit, I would love to speak to you after the talk. But I'm pretty sure what happened was the local option, the dry option for Routt County was on the ballot in 1908, and then it was defeated. But I'm pretty sure the town of Steamboat went dry. And the reason I say that, I'm not entirely sure, but I ran across an article that said they were moving all of the saloons to Brooklyn, across Fifth Street. On wheels, I guess, across the Fifth Street Bridge. Which just, I can't imagine what that would have been like in the early 20th century. I mean, you're talking mule teams, and it's wild. And I don't know why you wouldn't just build a new saloon given what we saw earlier. I don't think people were all that picky, even in 1800s. So this form of drinking, the kind done inside, right? The saloon drinking, that was what was targeted by Prohibition. But co-ed drinking was something that was not entirely unknown. It was just done in the outdoors. And so the beer garden, interestingly, is it's something imported from Germany, but it's also a relic of those times. And I am a good Front Range Coloradan. I like drinking outside on a nice sunny afternoon. I don't know if anyone else does, probably do. But it's not something new. And in fact, that is really the root of a lot of our drinking culture here in Colorado today. Prohibition wiped away saloon culture. We don't have anything like that anymore. The tap room, maybe, but like my dog goes there, could go there. A kid could go there if I had one. It's not really the same as that saloon. And it's because society changed. It's not serving the needs of men because it's not a male society, right? So necessarily, things had to change. Also, 20 years of illegality changed people's taste in beer. This is a picture of the very first hours of Prohibition in Uray. They're literally dumping beer into the street. Colorado went dry 40 years before the rest of the country, which I think for a state born in a saloon, the state legislature met in saloons to establish the Colorado territory. It's just kind of a whiplash. And for me as a historian, I find it fascinating because we're really talking about 60 years, 2 generations of people, going from that tent saloon in Creed to dumping out beer in the street. You know, it's a wild ride. And what happened after Prohibition to beer was essentially Coors. Colorado had 4 breweries after Prohibition, and only one of them made it all the way through. And Americans really lost their taste for anything other than that super light, super palatable, only tastes good if it's super cold, kind of light American lager. And the craft beer boom that our good friends at Storm Peak are helping us enjoy today. That really is a product of Prohibition, because in the 1970s and 1980s, there was sort of this awakening where travel became cheaper, but then it became possible to homebrew more easily and more professionally than ever before. And so folks like Charlie Papazian in Boulder and Fred Eckhart out in Portland started discovering these British ale tradition that had really gone by the wayside because of Prohibition. And that is the antecedent, the founding point of today's craft beer industry. And I don't think you would have that without Prohibition. I don't think you would have sort of this kaleidoscope, this explosion of flavors that really gets us to now. So that is how we get from this beer all the way back to that 10th Saloon in Creed. And I think it's just a more interesting way of understanding how our state came to be. So with that, I am going to actually plug my book. I wrote a book about Colorado's history through its beer industry called Beer Brewed at Altitude. It's a beer lover's history of Colorado with my friend and Chief Creative Officer at History Colorado, Jason Hansen. And it will be available for purchase in a little over a month. I guess a little under a month. So pretty soon, April 29th. Thank you so much.
Beer in whatever 1860 or before that, where'd the whiskey come from?
Yeah, great question. So the question is, where did the whiskey come from? So whiskey was probably what was available in those very earliest saloons. It came at first from New Mexico, would have been like the closest trading outpost. And whiskey is it's so different than beer in terms of getting it to a place that's remote.
Well, where was that made?
In New Mexico.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and so then back in 1860, you said it was like mostly men, at the saloons or whatever. What about like, the ladies of the evening? When did they start appearing?
They came here just as quickly as the saloons.
Coors is kind of known for their
So Coors is known for their 3.2 beer. I am super curious. What was the beer like before? Eli, the time that you're talking about, was that like the 10.5 stouts, 4.2?
Yeah.
Any ideas?
Absolutely, yeah. This is nerdier than I usually get because I love to brew beer. I'm a home brewer myself, but usually when I start telling my wife about it, she goes to sleep. So, like I said, the English ale brewing tradition, the golden ale, the stout, the porter, the amber ale, that all pretty much stayed in the East. Colorado was a lager beer place right from the very beginning. What that beer was like is probably like some of the nicer lager beers that we have from like Bierstadt Brewing Company, typically Helles or Pilsner style lagers. So they would be very light, really crisp, light on hops, and made notably almost entirely from imported ingredients. Because at the time, if you think about it, the imports were the quality ingredients, right? Those were the ones that had come from Europe. It had an era of sophistication, but also, like our hop industry and our barley industry was barely getting off the ground by the 1860s, 1870s. So, ingredients just for beer were difficult to come by, and these industrial breweries had to set up incredibly sophisticated complicated supply chains linking them to really to other breweries in St. Louis and Milwaukee. And that was just made much easier with the arrival of the railroad in the 1870s. Yeah.
Any idea where the word saloon came from?
Yeah, the question is where did the word saloon come from? And it's an Americanization or an Americanization of the French salon. The connection is a lot harder to discern if you make it all the way out to Colorado, but that's where it comes from. Yeah.
From like 1850 to like 1890, when America saw that boom in drinking, was that due to just the like sanitary water being declined essentially?
I'm so glad you asked that question. I get that question every time, and I'm glad you asked because I have never run across a primary source account of somebody in Colorado drinking beer because the water's dirty. I would love to be wrong. Like, if anyone has ever seen a journal or anything like that, please let me know. That is certainly true in Europe prior, to colonization in the West. It may have been true in certain places, but I think there's two things. First of all, by the 1850s, people had a pretty solid understanding of how water was contaminated, and they knew to drink upstream from town. They knew to get water from a purified source. But the other thing is, I think people just got sicker more often than we do now, and we just happen to not really think too much about it because we're super lucky to live in our time and place. So like I said, if anyone's ever seen that come up, please let me know, because I'm super fascinated. Yeah?
What kind of whiskey were people drinking? Bourbon or what?
The question is, what kind of whiskey were people drinking? And I'm afraid to tell you, it was rot gut. Because the very first whiskey in town in Denver was brought by Uncle Dick Wooten, and he got the name Uncle Dick because he rolled into town on Christmas Eve 1858 and started giving away Taos Lightning whiskey for free. What we're talking about is moonshine. It is clear and it is of questionable quality. It's not aged, and it's probably fermented from corn or a good amount of corn. In fact, the editor of the Rocky Mountain News, William Byers, upon being presented with the very first beer brewed from the Rocky Mountain Brewery, said it was quite good but innocent of hops, as our early whiskey was of wheat or rye. So yeah, I think it's bad. And the other thing to say is one of the things that drove the popularity of beer over whiskey wasn't just that lager is delicious and easy to drink, particularly if it's in hot summer months, but it's easy to tell if it's adulterated. It is really hard to tell if someone has poured some kind of weird poison, strychnine, something into whiskey to extend the life. But that's just what happened. And, when you think about, oh yeah, you're gonna go blind from drinking that rot gut moonshine, people did. It's not a urban legend. So that was one of the things driving this demand for beer that you saw the Rocky Mountain Brewery go from a shed like the size of this room to Coors being the biggest brewery around. Yeah.
When was the drinking age established and why?
Oh, that's a good question. When was the drinking age established and why? Boy, I really wish I had a better answer than I'm not totally sure. My understanding is that the modern drinking age came about with the end of Prohibition and a lot of compromises between states and the federal government over who is allowed to drive and on what roads, and it's all tied to funding because the federal government can't tell you what age, but they can tell you we're not going to give you money if you don't hold at a certain age. But in the early 20th century, I think the drinking age was, can you lift the bucket?
Any effort to refrigerate? Like, when did they try and ice it, or did they drink it in room temperature?
Yeah, lager has to be fermented at super cold temperature. And so every brewery would have had an ice house or an ice room. And it's amazing what you can do with sawdust and ice cut from a pond. So a lot of breweries actually had a corresponding ice company. The Crystal Springs Brewing and Ice Company in Boulder, they were they were in the ice business in order to vertically integrate, essentially. Because if you can control the cost of ice, you can control the cost of lagering. Coors dug a lagering cave into South Table Mountain, if you're familiar with that, filled with sawdust. So, cold beer has always been a premium. I think if you were in Creed in 1858, you're certainly not getting a cold beer. You're probably not even getting one until like the early 1900s. The refrigerated rail car came about in the late 1880s, and that really changed the game because you could get unpasteurized beer from brewery to consumer without it going bad. And pasteurized beer doesn't taste very good because it's been heated. And so that was a major selling point actually for Coors beer, who continued this cold filtering and never pasteurized their beer all the way until the 20th century. And what I think is really interesting is I went to ask my mom, who grew up in Laramie and then moved to Denver, what Coors meant to her growing up, and she was like, well, that was the craft beer of the time. It was, it was better than what was on offer, and all their marketing was around how it was always kept cold. And whether or not you believe that, I think just depends on how close you are to Coors' marketing department. But for a long time, it actually, it really did make a big difference to the final flavor of beer.
Were there distributorship wars at that time? And also, what's the history of taxation of the liquor industry?
Oh, interesting question. So there's always been competition for distribution. A lot of companies in Colorado integrated their distribution companies. So Coors has always had a distribution company. Philip Zang, who took over the Rocky Mountain Brewing Company and opened the Zang Brewing Company, which was the first professionally brewed beer, someone trained to be a brewer in Colorado. We have one of his beer wagons actually in our museum, in our collection, and it's really big. Totally not a part of the story. Taxation is an interesting topic insofar as it's interesting to people who like stamps. So I'm honestly not all that sure. I know that a lot of beer barrels would have been stamped with an excise tax essentially, but it's always varied, right? And it depends on your county, it depends on your municipality. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have more for you on that.
So maybe you could clear up an urban legend I heard. Similar to taxation, but you talked about in your thing, like a pinch of gold dust to pay for your drink, right? So this urban legend was, the term shot of whiskey came from a cowboy comes into a bar, he doesn't have money, but he puts a .45 caliber shell on the bar, and that pays for a shot of whiskey. Hence, they call it a shot of whiskey. Now, is that an urban legend, or did you ever hear anything similar?
That's my first time hearing about the shot of whiskey being exchanged for a bullet.
Right, correct.
I tend to think that it's in the urban legend category because I think ammo was a lot cheaper than whiskey for most of Colorado history.
Okay.
So that's my guess. Sorry. Candace.
Other elixirs that they would serve. Randy Samuelson Brown talks a lot about snake poison and all these crazy things, and then also the coins that would have been for a shot or a kiss or other things upstairs.
Yeah, sure. So interestingly, the term mixologist dates back to the 19th century. And I'm a millennial. We all had our mixologist moment back when speakeasies came back through. But saloons were pouring way more than just whiskey. And I think that's kind of what Candace is alluding to. So depending where you are in the state, you might get a dollop, a dram, a shot of whiskey, and it could come with just about any soft drink. And a lot of the time, lemonade would have been a chaser or a back. Hot sauce and tequila is an old combination, especially from the southeastern part of the state. The late 19th century, the early 20th century is the heyday of the cocktail. So the old-fashioned, Manhattan, bee's knees, these are old drinks, and you would have definitely seen those on the menu at some of the more upscale, particularly the more urban saloons around the state. saloons would often have, this is something we're pretty familiar with today, right? You would get, there would be a promotion for the saloon, and they would give coins to patrons to be sort of like an in-house currency, right? So it's like, if I go to my local bar near our museum in Denver and I buy one beer, they'll give me a coin that's good for another beer later on. And I can come back and use it, or I can use it the same day. Same principle. And you could often use that coin to pay for a beer or for a mixed drink at the saloon. Or if the saloon happened to have some other services available from the local women, sometimes those coins can be used for that as well. Is that what you were? Yeah. Yes?
Hi. So in college I did like a short paper on like the tavern culture in Silverton, and I remember one day reading the consumption rates of whiskey and beer there, and it just being really high. And these guys were, I know, you obviously know, like messed up, right? So I'm wondering if you saw, like throughout your research, or just time doing this, like relationships between like people's ability to function, people's ability to work in mines or survive even in them, and then the relationship between that and consumption.
Yeah. Public intoxication is a really different thing now. I think if you were to go to any mining town, particularly Silverton, Leadville, the town drunk stumbling down the street was not alone. And you would have to get to a point of immense saturation for it to be remarkable that you were inebriated. This is a time before workplace safety laws. This is a time before public drinking codes. Those things are really a product of the progressive movement and of prohibition later on. But just sort of to take that to the next step, when you read historic newspapers from Colorado from the early 20th century, it's sobering, and I use that word intentionally. So many of the stories coming from about the ills of alcohol come from women who were just in general receiving an unequal share of the negative effects of alcohol. And there's a notable story from Longmont, or is it Fort Collins? Fort Collins, where a man killed his wife while intoxicated and was drug out of the local the local jail and lynched because of just the brazenness of his murder. And he had been known around town for beating her while being drunk. So that's not an uncommon story. Scandinavian immigrant in Leadville was arrested for threatening his wife and his hungry kids with an axe after drinking away his earnings in a saloon. So, it's not a very pretty side of drinking. And I think it's one that today, with our modern conversations around temperance and I think we're going ever closer to, the swinging the pendulum away from consumption of alcohol towards, more understanding of what its potential negative effects are in society. I mean, you see this all around us, right? Like, more people are moving towards not drinking. It's just what you see in the news. That's all stuff we've learned before. But our modern drinking rates just don't compare. It's just not even the same scale. Yeah.
As far as the, you had a slide up with one of the Scandinavian saloons downtown in Denver. Mm-hmm. How many buildings are still around that are, the original saloon, and are there a lot of them?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a good number. A lot of them aren't still saloons. A lot of them, got paved over because they were sort of ramshackle. I think there's one in Leadville that's still a saloon. That's been a saloon essentially forever. But it's not a lot. And I think what's interesting, especially in Denver, is that there's just been so many cycles of urban renewal in that downtown core. Stuff gets paved over a lot. So I think the answer to your question is not very many. There are quite a few surviving from the 30s and 40s. though. Like there's a lot of tied houses. There's a couple of restaurants that still have, Coors in Pueblo, Coors Gray's Cavern, but these are all more modern. And Prohibition really just wiped those all away. People went to movies instead of to the saloon.
They just closed them during Prohibition. They leveled them, or?
Yeah, a lot of them got paved over, and Prohibition in Colorado lasted for almost 20 years, so you're not going to be able to do a lot with that space, especially in a time, I think a lot of that time, Prohibition was the Great Depression, so people are flooding out of Colorado. You're not getting a lot of people to come back in and occupy those spaces. I'm trying to get around, yeah.
I wrote a Western about 1876, but I couldn't find out how much they charged at bars for whiskey and beer.
Yeah, it would depend, honestly, saloon to saloon, bar to bar. They would always be trying to undercut the competition or to establish new regulars. A pinch of gold dust, particularly in those early days, we're talking about very light pinch. Probably part of a small amount of your day's pannings would have paid for a whiskey. I think, 25 cents to 50 cents, depending on where you are. That would have been sort of the upper end for whiskey and beer. 10, 15 cents, somewhere in there, I think, for probably around the time that you're talking about. Yeah, it would have been expensive because you have to get it to where it is, and it's remote. Yeah.
So I arrived late, so I apologize if you went over this, but are there any notable bootleggers during the Prohibition era in Colorado?
Oh my, yes. So the heart of the bootlegging trade in Colorado was the Pueblo, Trinidad, Denver axis, and it was very much controlled by the emerging mob. So there were two crime families at the outside of Prohibition that were vying for control of the Southern Colorado liquor trade, the Danas and the Carlinos. And the Carlinos were driven out of the liquor business, literally at the business end of a sawed-off shotgun, over about 5 years, right at the beginning of Prohibition in 1916. And then by 1933, the crime associated with Prohibition had just exploded. And part of that is you've taken something that a lot of people really like voting in Prohibition was really close in Colorado, 11,000 votes out of 55,000 against Prohibition, so about a quarter said no. So you took something that was really popular and immediately made it illegal. Well, that's just gonna skyrocket the crime problem. But then the compounding that were these crime families. And in Denver, the problem got so out of control that some wag writing in an editorial in the Denver Post said it would be great if the Denver police would catch something other than a cold. But that was after a house in North Denver exploded because the still blew up. Or it was blown up by a rival family. Sorry, we don't really know. Yeah?
How did Coors survive Prohibition?
Coors was really interesting. So like every brewery in America, they wanted to try and find a way to make their business kind of work tangentially without the alcohol. So they initially jumped into non-alcoholic near beer and malted milk. So malted milk really carried them all the way through. I think they only stopped making it in the 60s. And then the other thing that they developed during Prohibition was a packaging, or they attempted to develop a packaging system, but it ended up being Coors porcelain, which is today's Coors Tech. And during the Cold War, they were making insulators for nuclear triggers. So Coors, they really went out of their way to try and diversify, and they almost didn't make it. I think the only thing that saved them was, first of all, the malted milk business. And then second, they had the size and they owned so much of their brewery operation that when it became clear beer was going to be leading the way back, which it did thanks to 3.2% beer in 1933, they were the only brewery in Colorado ready to go. they were the first ones to start distributing. And that is how Coors became the Western beer. You know, by 1968, they were the only brewery in the state, and they only distributed in 11 states west of the Mississippi until 1973, I believe. So, you know, that's kind of why it was, you know, Smokey and the Bandit thing, where they are trucking beer to these. But my dad went to school in St. Louis. His parents lived in Denver. Every time he came out, his buddies were like, bring me a case of Coors. It was always spoiled or rancid because they didn't do any pasteurization or preservation, but it was special. So it really drove the brand. Yeah, one more back.
What do you think was the first brewery slash
Yeah, I wish you didn't ask me that. I couldn't find out. I was combing through the pilot and I couldn't find the name, but I think that one, Snow and White, I think they were among the first to really make it. But if someone knows, I would love to know. I would love to know.
It's really hard. We've been trying to research that subject quite a bit. And it's like everything that has to do with Brooklyn. There's like very few photos, very few articles, access to the newspaper collection that you do. And it's just really hard. You find one or two names, you don't really find dates. So it's like this elusive subject. But there is a book called help me, Myra, a local book that was done by Laurel Watson, all about the red light districts in Mountain County in northwest Colorado. And so any information that could be dug up has been dug up in that. It's called Gamble Valley Sin Circuit.
Yeah.
So that book is available at the museum store if you want to learn more about the local connection.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's my time.